Okay, this morning you all talked a lot about your father. This afternoon I'd like to start and have you talk about your mother. What did she do, and can you describe some of her activities around town besides taking care of you? Anybody?
Well, since I have the oldest of memories, and I've thought about this often, obviously, and as you framed that question, I think the town was, quite honestly, secondary to my mother's primary interest, because her primary interest was her husband. And if she had a role, over the years it was that of a facilitator. There's nothing that the old man did that he could have done without her help. Aiding and abetting all the way.
Did she ever actually work for him in the office?
I'm not sure about working in the office. I would sort of think that they rather studied that, and she didn't work in the office, even when he was over his first office. I don't recall her being there. It was a small office.
Okay.
And certainly by the time we got to the new office, 2 High Street, and subsequently moved to 4 High Street, she was too busy with other things. And so even though she really, I don't think she ever quit being a nurse, but she wasn't a practicing nurse. I would say she was a buffer on the phone and protecting him and keeping us out of his way too at times.
Who were the people that worked for your dad in the office? Somebody mentioned a Loretti, I think.
Margaret. Yeah, Margaret. But Margaret was my first babysitter, and probably Fred's, and probably Richard's too. But she went on to graduate from Farmington High School, and when the office opened at 2 High Street, I don't know how long after that she came on, but she was a fixture in that office. And I don't know where she qualified today's vocabulary or how Medicare would facilitate her charge, but she and Agnes McCarthy and later Grace Foster were the 3 people that essentially ran that office, with the addition of Mrs. Steiner.
Yes, Mrs. Steiner.
And Mrs. Steiner was the bookkeeper, meticulous, dealt with scheduling and so forth, and just made it all happen.
Okay.
And she worked forever. I mean, she must have been in her 80s when she finally stopped.
Okay.
And Grace lived upstairs.
Later she did, yes.
Okay. Now, if you could describe for us any memories you have of some of your neighbors and people who lived in the area, and I will just read names to you, and whoever has a memory of that person can just speak up. First of all, you talked about Fritz Paisler.
Well, I remember working with him a lot because, I'm not bragging, I think I probably spent more time with chickens than you guys did, all told, on a fairly regular basis. And Fritz was in charge over all of the chicken operation as it expanded. Richard mentioned this morning, it rapidly expanded. You gave a good account of the history of that project, but in terms of how it impacted our yard, it just took over the whole backyard. And that pond that was there was filled in, and more chicken houses were built up, and he rented the lot that was,
Behind the McCarthy's.
behind the McCarthy's.
Wanda Deming.
Yeah. Set up, and I think there were 8 chicken yards there.
Ranges.
Pens. Big,
Pens.
Big pens.
Because you couldn't have too many chickens if you were trying to, get a fatter ones.
Okay.
And Fritz was,
He was a jack of all trades.
Okay.
know,
And he worked for your family?
yeah.
Well, he worked at Miss Porter's Dairy
Yeah.
during the day,
Yeah.
and in the afternoon and weekends he worked for us. But he used to go with me to the chicken shows.
Oh, yeah.
We'd load him up in the station wagon and take him to the eastern states. And then I'll never forget, we got all the chickens at the eastern states. We were going to get them out, and we couldn't find one of the crates. And Fritz said, okay. He grabbed the bird, and I was sitting in the car holding the bird. Fritz came out of the building 5 minutes later with the crate, and all I could see was through the skylights that were open, dusts and birds flying out. Find out that the crate was supporting a stand of birds, and he wasn't going to let that stop us from going home. So we grabbed it, put it in the car, and off we went. But we went a lot of places together because we were hauling the birds. And then as I got older and I drove, I would do it without him. But I'd go to Homestead, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island. There was a chicken show, and there was Boston Garden. And we'd take the chickens up and pick them up and bring them back.
Your next door neighbors on High Street were the McCarthy sisters.
Right.
And somebody this morning mentioned John McCarthy. Did he live there with them?
No, he would come out and mow their grass, and take care of the place, and then he was there about every day. And he was like a friend for us all.
And the McCarthy sisters themselves, what do you remember about them? And
I remember most clearly Agnes because my father's a nurse. I must attest, I don't really remember the other 3 that well, but I knew her. And she was at the office all the time.
In her white uniform.
In a white uniform, she was. My sense is that they were all professional in whatever they did. What their origins were, I don't really know. What brought them to Farmington.
And when we were talking about the Judats garage, somebody mentioned somebody named Dick Grisey.
Right. He was the son-in-law, but he worked at the garage, and he'd married their daughter. And they had one child, but they lived in an apartment in that house that the Judatses lived in. And he was a very good mechanic, and he ran a lot of the shop along with the others. But yeah.
Okay. And Fred, you talked about a basketball setup at the garage. Would you please elaborate on that?
Yes. The parking lot for the garage had several garages for the cars that they used to chauffeur people. But they also had a basketball net
Backboard.
with a backboard. It's important. And so it was just adjacent to our backyard. And we would, when we weren't playing football or baseball, we could play basketball or play games. And many hours playing, I forget the names.
And to be more accurate, I never thought of it really before, but what a nuisance we must have been to the Judas's, because they
Yes.
weren't that far from their kitchen or their
Yes,
factory.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes.
I can remember being out there when it was dark and
Yeah,
easily after 6:30.
yeah. But it was a good example of sort of neighborhood integration or neighborliness. Same time we were playing basketball, Richard was in there learning how to fix engines with Mike Garaki. And Mike Garaki was also a basketball coach, and in the evenings, he would come, I remember going many times up to the Henry Wallace gym here to watch him play sometimes, because he had a seniors team or something.
Well, Fred stimulates something here because they're, and remember, this was all before television,
Yeah.
but at the Noel Wallace gym, there used to be a inter-town league competition which consisted of older, some college-trained, Webb Groton was one, who played college basketball in those times, and they'd come back, and I guess you'd call it semi-pro. I don't know how much they got, if they got anything. There wasn't any admission that I remember.
No.
There were no bleachers, so you just had people lined up. But there was, during the winter, there'd be, I think, pretty regularly
At least once or twice a week.
Once or twice a week, yeah.
Okay. Did any of you have any recollections of Archibald McLeish or his family?
Well, I can attest to those because Bill McLeish was a contemporary. And his grandfather was Mr. Hitchcock, who had holdings in Unionville and in Riverton as the Hitchcock chair factory and so forth. And that was his mother's father. And Bill would appear, and I never quite understood where he came from, but I knew he'd come there. And, I just sort of know, I can remember Bill McLeish showing me in his bedroom a letter from the White House, where he'd been asked to become, I forget his first title, but ultimately he became Librarian of Congress and so forth. And so that was a big deal to see a letter from the White House, signed by FDR, and he goes on. But he was a poet of some renown, and interestingly, I would occasionally run into him at odd times of the year and ask him about Bill and where he was, and he'd say something. And I think there was mention made this morning of going to fishing camp in Maine, or in Vermont. And Archibald McLeish showed up there one summer, not at the camp, but at the inn, which was sort of associated. So he was a fisherman of sort, and but Bill McLeish went on to be an author of sorts, a Yalie again, as Archibald was too, and worked for Kingman Brewster as an administrative assistant at Yale, and then went to Woods Hole and published, and he wrote a book which he came here to this library for a reading, which was entitled Uphill with Archie, which was sort of an autobiography and biography. This was some 20-odd years ago, at least, and I think he's still alive. Paul and I have talked about where he might be.
Okay. You mentioned this morning some people named Kegley. Would you please explain who they are and what they did?
They lived across the street from us on High Street, and he worked for Avon Farm School, Mrs. Riddle, and he chauffeured back day students from Farmington to the school. And I think there was 4 of us that every day rode to school and back with him.
Did you know the Tafts or the Sperrys who had a
Yes.
plumbing business on the
Yeah,
avenue?
Taft's Hardware, which was right across the street from Brickwalk. And then the Sperrys had a plumbing business. And the Tafts had quite a hardware store in those days. And yeah, we lived there just about. And then the Sperrys, he did all the plumbing in our house on High Street. He was a local plumber and very good.
Okay.
I can add a pen to that, some more modern uses of that facility, because stimulated by the earlier question about girlfriends. One of my former girlfriends ended up in the 50s opening a sort of a kindergarten day school in that same building of the Taft Hardware store. Another girlfriend, either before or after that, she and her husband opened and ran for a year or two, a antique store, kind of stores, I get the picture. I think it was called Fife and Drum, or Drum and Fife or something. And she was married then, and the married name was Holmgren, who also came from Farmington, way out in the eastern area.
How about Rebecca and Fred Jones?
They were characters. She was an artist and he was a very talented builder, and he built several houses behind his off of Farmington Avenue. But Fred was a little strange. He used to dry leaves and put them in the walls for insulation, and it worked. But and he would take and dry them in his barn or somehow, and then we'd pour them in the wall, button the wall up, and he was very good at taking old houses down and putting them back up. And a couple of houses were on his property were brought in from other areas, and they were peg and beam, and he would put them together, put them back, and he was a character, believe me. I remember one time we got called in the fire department, and the house was full of smoke. We get in there, and jeepers, all this heat was coming out of the electrical box. So I think it was Johnny Batista said, "Wait a minute," and he unscrewed one of his fuses, and then behind it was a penny. And Fred didn't want to buy new fuses. He put a penny in there, put it back in. It just had overloaded the circuit, and all the wires were smoking.
Wow.
But and another incident I'll never forget was I used to hang around with the Blasey brothers, and Fred had a pond out in back, and he went out to clean the snow off the ice, and the tractor he was using went right through the ice. So the Blasey brothers came up with their backhoe and picked it up. And we put it in his barn, and we're trying to take it apart and dry it out, and we said, "Gee, it's cold in here." Fred says, "Okay." He goes over and he sticks a pencil in the thermostat, and about 20 minutes later, you could read the boiler. It was so hot for me because it was continuously going. We were sweating, and that was Fred. He just went up, pulled the pencil out, and the furnace would cool down.
He was ahead of his time.
He was way ahead of his time.
Silicon Valley.
But his wife is an interesting unknown too. I think she went on to be quite an artist also, and
Rebecca, yeah.
did she,
How about the Cogans, Frank and Lillian Cogan?
Oh, yeah.
Well, first of all, we shouldn't forget their son.
well, Jimmy's part of this, yes.
Yeah, who stayed with us for
Yeah.
a couple of years.
Yeah.
Is Cogan's son? Okay.
They rented an apartment, I don't know whose house it was, right next to Russ Hunter's building there, set back. And they
Yeah.
lived there for years.
Right.
But when Jimmy came home from school, he stayed at our house because there was no room for him.
Yeah. He went to school down in New York.
The Cogans, Mrs. Cogan had been a teacher in Bayonne, New Jersey. And Dr. Cogan was a dentist. And they moved to Farmington, I'm not quite sure why. They had one child, one male child, Jimmy, James. And they lived in this small house directly next to Jonesville. And sort of receded back that had belonged to, I think it was Harry Nay's chauffeur. And it was a small house, fit them perfectly. But they have a son who, by that time, had developed into being a singer of sorts, and was going to the St. Thomas Church School in New York City because he was part of the choir. And when he needed a place to lay his head down at night, well, my mother and father offered him my extra bed, and so I had a periodic roommate living growing up. Jimmy was a couple of years older than me,
Okay.
and that continued. The Cogans later moved into the apartment. Maybe this was first, the apartment over the 2 High Street. And Jimmy went on to Yale and went on to Kent, on to Yale, on to Harvard Law, and quite a law career in New York.
Sullivan and Cromwell.
Sullivan, Bunnell, and also had a lot to do with the Rockefeller estate up in Woodstock as one of his people.
Do you all remember Theodate Pope Riddle? Do you have any memories of her?
Yeah. Mrs. Riddle was a patient of my father's, but she was, I kept him on the phone hours on top of hours, day in and day out. And she was so kind that she used to send him a check for his consultation on the phone because she felt guilty of taking up his time, but he spent hours talking to her on the phone. Then the school, she gave it or leased it to the Army for the blind. And they had some entertainer come to perform at the school for the blind. And she called up my mother and said, could Richard go with me? So I went with her, I forget how old I was, and we got escorted by the general or whoever was there, right to the front row, and they had a chair for me and a chair for her. We watched the show, and then we were escorted out and back to Farmington.
You died when you were 13, I believe, Richard, so you couldn't have been too old.
No. I was about 13 or, 12 or 13. But it was very interesting. She was, I talked to her, not a lot, but quite a few times. I've been up to the house.
Did you know her adopted sons at
No.
all? No. Okay.
We did, my only memory of her is sort of implicit in an arrangement that she approved. When winter came, our favorite sliding place was
Oh,
down the hill from the Riddle Estate all the way down to
Yeah.
the white fence there along High Street. There's a house there now, and that was, And often, what the snow was
Oh, yeah.
hard crust.
Sliding.
And it hit the
But-
grass.
Yes, yes. And
Okay.
she never, well, she acquiesced.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, she raised sheep also,
Oh, okay.
and that's where I got interested in sheep. And I ended up with a couple of lambs that I brought and had them in a chicken coop. And then I would shear them and take the wool up to Mr. House, and he would bring me back a check.
Mhm.
Well, I had the experience of visiting Mrs. Riddle to have tea. And I can clearly remember only 2 instances, there may have been more. And I would appear at the front door, and the butler would let me in, and my mother dressed me appropriately. And I would sit next to Mrs. Riddle in chairs that are there now in the tour. And these, now I recognize them to be gorgeous works of art. At that time, art was something I did at grammar school, crayons. But I can remember she and her husband visiting 4 High Street one time. And particularly struck was I because, as I recall, his birth date was July 12th, and I was July 11th. Well, that's a pretty good connection. But I've learned more about her since, as she's been amply described. But
How about the Bissels?
I don't know the Bissels well.
Have I got the right family?
Yeah.
I got to know, well, my parents obviously knew them pretty well.
Well, they're with the Bissell family house, a big one off Colton Street, which I think is now a monastery or some Catholic.
Okay.
But that was the Bissell house,
I'm
It
getting
was
it.
built in the 20s.
built in the 20s. And Richard Bissell, I think, was of that family
Okay.
and went on to have distinction and curiosity for Fred in his political science role
Yeah.
because of his servings in Washington.
Yeah, with the CIA.
And I think there was a Yale connection there too.
So I got to go and interview him for my doctoral research on foreign policy, American foreign policy with regard to Indonesia. And my mother arranged that for me.
Probably.
Yeah. I just had this one long session with him in my role of doing research on American foreign policy in Indonesia, because he had been, I think, number 2 in the CIA in a period where there was a lot of plotting with regard to Indonesia. And,
How about Ruth and Joe Hyde?
Again, that house, first of all.
Well, the full story on the, more of the story on the Hydes became clear to me last night because I had 2-hour dinner with Joe Hyde, contemporary of mine, friend of Fred's, friend of Richard's.
Another Yale graduate.
And a Yale graduate, a gunnery graduate. And we remembered the Hydes as having moved to Farmington into a house whose number I've provided you as being 36 High Street. He moved with his stepmother, Ruth, from West Hartford or Bloomfield sometime in the 40s, late 40s. And unfortunately, that was the time I was off in Exeter first before Fred. And he ended up going to Kingswood, went to the gunnery school, went to Yale, and he pretty much, his stepmother passed away in, I think, late 40s or maybe early 50s, I forget what. But it turns out that Joe and his mother and father first came to Farmington in the early 30s and lived, and you're going to have to give me a number here again, but the big house on the end of High Street and Mountain Road again, across from the Bissells and across from the Joneses. And they lived there for a while.
It's the same side of the street as the old Whitman Tavern, you mean?
The same side of the street as the Whitman
At the
Museum.
corner of Mountain Road and High is 49.
Museum, 49.
49, with columns.
With
and so forth.
columns, yes.
Okay. And I believe Joe's mother died somewhere in the early 30s from cancer, Joe told me. And again, my father had taken care of her and so forth. And that was all new matter to me. And but he's alive and well and living in New Hampshire and still active.
You all this morning mentioned Graham Jones, a friend of all of yours?
Yes.
Yes.
He was, I think, probably, I was really the closest to him. And he lived on,
He lived directly across the street from Joe Hyde's
Right.
first house,
right,
the White House on the corner.
Norton Lane.
yeah. And, well, he had a tennis court, for one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he went to Noah Wallace for a while, but moved to Kingswood. But even despite that, I hung out a lot with him, playing tennis, but doing other things. And then he ended up,
He was at Exeter.
yeah, he first went to Kent, I think, and then transferred to Exeter.
Wasn't he quite a golfer too?
Yes, I think you're right. Yeah,
Okay.
But
How
Father-
about your other friends, Maury Shea and Art Haworth? Do you have anything more you'd like to say about either of them?
Oh boy.
The day isn't long enough to talk about Morty.
He lived at our house.
You need to get him on tape too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
He is. Okay.
he's,
He and
Okay.
our Howarth are very close.
All right. How about Russ Hunter?
Yeah.
the Hunters, well, there was Russ, who was the oldest. There was Sam, who was a little bit older than I was. And there was Polly Ann. And there may have been one or two others in there too. I didn't know them all. But they lived in the house literally in back of Stanley Whitman House now, the
Was-
brick house.
Was Russ part of your football group?
No, he was
Good
older.
athlete.
He went on to be a football captain at UConn and had been in the service and went back and so forth.
So he was enough older than you.
And was here in town forever and
Yeah. Okay.
so forth. His sister is married, living in, last I knew, in Greenwich. And Sam ran a model airplane club in there. They had a big room upstairs in that house. And somehow we all got involved in making model airplanes. And that went on for a year or two, a winter or two.
Okay.
But,
Let's switch topics now. and go on to the English children who came here at the beginning of the Second World War. I'm curious about why they came, who sponsored them, how many of them there were, how old they were, and particularly who they lived with. So if anybody would like to talk about that.
Well, I've got two ways of talking about that because I remember clearly going to junior high school in 1941, that there appeared, and these girls primarily that were Noel Wallace and so forth, who had come from England and were living in Farmington. And this was in 40s. Didn't know much about why they came, except it was all related to the war, WW2, and the evacuation after England had its problems. And they were in Farmington. And had a lot to do with Miss Porter's, I figured out, because they resided at the house next to the Catholic Church, which I think is now owned by Miss Porter's, and I think was Sarah Porter's house. And that's where the girls with their mothers, in some cases, lived. They're based on subsequent research that sort of stimulated by a reference to that I came across in a book written by the Dr. Downs, who I had mentioned earlier, or more specifically by Eleanor Fosdick Downs, where she talks about she and her husband sort of ministering to these kids and their parent, just the mothers, while they were in Farmington. And I just sort of got wondered more about that, which led me to learn a lot more. Because they were part of a group sponsored by a Yale faculty-related committee out of New Haven, where about 100 kids, male, females, mothers, some pregnant mothers, were brought to New Haven in the summer of 1940 from Canada after they'd come over, and were dispersed from there to other locations in New England. I think the number was 13 kids that came to Farmington with 2 or 3 mothers. And the majority of the others stayed in New Haven and went to school in New Haven. And these were kids that ranged all the way from literally infancy. There were several born in New Haven, and I'm not sure one may have been born here. So they were part of the scene and the history, and it remains a topic of curiosity and interest. Unfortunately, some of those records are under a 100-year limitation, which we're trying to get around, but there's specifically case files on each of the students. I did go through the archives that are open at Yale, and I found, curiously enough, what I was looking for. And there are billings in there in fine detail of medical charges from Dr. Bunnell. And parenthetically, I should add also from my wife's uncle, Bill Wiebert, who was family doctor to many in Avon, who also took care of some of those kids and billed people. The sponsorship, according to research uncovered recently, clearly identified Robert Porter Keep and Wilmarth Lewis as being two of the large funders of this thing, of this venture in Farmington. And
Do you have any specific memories of any of the children? Did you get to know them while they were here?
there were one girl in particular that stuck out. Actually, she was one of three girls, I think, in that family. And her last name was B-U-R-N, Burn. And I think she was Kathleen. And turns out that her father was a scientist, a pharmacological scientist at Oxford, who in later years was awarded an honorary degree at Yale for his work in that field. And so I've learned a little bit, but also not mentioned yet, there was another, not a girl, but a boy named Jonathan Downs, not related to the Dr. Downs, but from England, who came with his mother. And they spent some time in Farmington, but more time in West Hartford, living with a family. And Jonathan went to Kingswood. And lo and behold, Jonathan was killed in an automobile accident on Farmington Avenue back in 1943, I think. And he had temporary quarters here, and I think his mother taught at Miss Porter's also, but those are probably more history than you wanted.
Okay, now you get a chance to talk about the creation of Brickwalk Lane. Your father did it, so tell us why, how it got started, and everything that you would like to say about that.
Well, it started because of the profits that the chickens were producing, the sale of the chickens to Cuba. The IRS came in and told him he's going to pay extra taxes. And he says, well, I'll figure out a way of not paying taxes. So that's what really started Brickwalk Shops.
I never really heard that story. And again, you were there.
I was there,
Yeah.
right?
But I think it's misleading. I put it as a question. Aren't there some other factors that are very important, albeit this may have been the trigger? And because I think number one, the garden stuff, I mean, that had its own genesis, and I'm not clear on this, but I thought the Williamsburg model was something of an inspiration, but you were clarifying that for me.
Yeah. But I think the big thing was these buildings were being available.
Yes.
That he didn't want destroyed.
I think,
Like the Wright's package store is a schoolhouse.
Yeah.
And then there's the next building that was on that same block that we took the Wright's package store. There was the building that became the yarn shop.
Yeah.
And then there's a piece of the yarn shop became part of the wig shop because they took a chunk of it and moved it down there, and then they just added to it to finish off that.
Yeah. But historic preservation was a cardinal factor here.
Yeah.
The way you framed it before, it sounded more that it was sort of an economic thing.
Was Parsons actually saying if no one wants these buildings where my dealership
Yep.
is going to go, they will
would
be
get
demolished?
destroyed, yeah.
And therefore your dad
He
comes.
wanted to preserve them.
And he went searching for buildings too, that
Well,
building
that
was-
comes out later.
Okay.
But then we got Wright's Package Store, then we built the drugstore, which is the building next to it, and then we built the building that, what's her name's candy store was in, or gift or food store, Ruth Howe. I can't think of her name, but
And Howard's Cooking.
Ann Howard. Yeah, that's the
That's
next
on your-
building.
Mhm.
And then
That was built, yes.
yeah, then we had the house that was moved from out in West Farmington
Yeah.
that we tore down, we took down piece by piece and reconstructed. That's the Teeds and Tweeds building. And reconstructed that. And while we were building that, he wanted to put apartments above, but the roof line under the zoning wouldn't allow him to raise the roof. So this builder we had, Charlie Kilgore, is pretty clever. He says, I can do that. He just raised the roof enough to get through the zoning. So we had 2 apartments upstairs, which eventually my grandmother from Pennsylvania moved into one. Then we rented the other one, then we had Teeds and Tweeds downstairs.
The building that was your dad's office was already there?
They
Yes.
built that in 1938,
Just before.
before they moved the other.
Yeah.
The discussion earlier about mowing a lot of grass, that
Yeah.
was a lot of grass that got mowed for a long time.
Yes, yes.
What's now covered with
Now,
buildings?
yeah,
Right.
now blacktop, yes.
Chicken coops and buildings.
Rich, how many times did you have to stop traffic to move houses in?
Well, the big traffic stop was bringing the Wrights building and the Teeds and or the yarn shop, because they had to
Okay.
move those in as structures.
And did that happen on the same weekend?
Yeah, it happened all at the same time, and the building they bring the Wrights down was a problem because the power company or the light company didn't want to raise or wanted a lot of money to raise the cable. And Louis Turgeon said, "No, we can do this. We'll knock the chimney off at roof level, and we'll dig down the sidewalk and that." They just dug it all out, and they ramped it right down. The power company was there. They were all watching. He had guys on the roof with big leather straps on, and they raised the cable maybe 1/8 of an inch. The house slid right under.
Precision.
And who was this that did the job?
Louis Turgeon. He was the guy that moved the original house, and he moved the other houses
Oh,
first.
okay.
He's from East Hartford. He was a well-known house mover in the
Remember how
area.
to spell his name?
Louis Turgeon.
Did they put things on skids?
Oh, yeah. It was a great big set of dollies. They jacked it up, and then they put the dollies under it, and then they ramped it down to the road. They came around the corner, and came around the bend, and then they had to go this way into Brickwalk, which is now Brickwalk. It tied up the traffic for a good 4 or 5 hours.
Wow.
And your dad built buildings at Brickwalk? Did he take mortgages on those properties, or did he
Yeah,
just pay for them?
yeah, that's how he got the tax deduction.
And who
Yeah.
built the new buildings for them?
He did. It was Charlie Kilgore from Avon was the builder.
Okay.
And then he got those all built, and then he wanted the bank building. And the reason for the bank building was that was support the mortgages that he had on the others. They wanted something that was secure, and they thought the bank building. So we built the bank building, and they spent hours going over the plans, and we I think it was Charlie Kilgore that came up with the idea. He said, look, for a few dollars more, we can build the foundation the same as the vault on the first floor. Because the vault had to be on the first floor of the bank. And they said, oh, that's great. Then we can put a fireplace in the apartment above, on top of the vault. And they built the foundation to the same specs. They wired it. And they made sure the door coming in from the outside would take the door that was supposed to be the bank vault door. And they excluded that from the lease. And the bank came to them about a year later and said, God, we gotta have more vault space. We said, we can give it to you. And they said, what do you mean? So we took them down cellar and opened up the plastic or the plywood door. There's your vault, bring your door in. And so we rented them that space for the same spot, price we were getting for upstairs. And the bank was very pleased with the extra vault they wanted. Didn't cost them a lot of money. Then the apartment above was rented to Amadon. She was, I think she was sort of like a retired, but had a housekeeper or companion with her. And he was a banker from New York and fell in love with Farmington. So they put the fireplace in there, and she had a beautiful apartment with a nice fireplace.
Another Yale connection,
Yeah,
the Amadon family.
yeah. And that's how the bank became.
And how long did all of this take from start
did
to
it begin?
finish? Was it several years?
I'd say 54 to 58.
We were out of yeah.
Yeah, that's a good time frame. And, yeah, because the building the Teeds and Tweeds was in, that took a little longer because they had to take it down and bring it over and re-erect it. And then when they were building it, putting it back up, these beautiful wide boards that were sheathing on the building they brought over from the other side of Farmington. And he said, no, he said, we'll run those through a planer and we'll use them for flooring. So they sheathed it with plywood and put the clapboards on top of that. And it looks the same, but the flooring inside, if you walk, are all the original sheathing, run through a planer and cut down. And they made the floors out of that.
Rich, was, while we're on that subject, was the relocation from out from the Meadows, Meadow Road, thank you, of the Bill Day Museum to Wilmarth Lewis's location. Was that happened in the same time, the transaction? Was that house was related?
That was on the property, I think, yeah.
Related to the
Bill Day,
the restored
Yeah.
house?
I think that came from over there,
Okay.
yeah. But they took it down board by board, whatever.
How did he happen to be involved with a house that was that far away?
Somebody, he saw it, or somebody brought it to his attention that it was an old house, thought he'd be interested in it. So he went out and looked at it, and we bought the property. And then we moved the house off and sold the property.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to say in regard to Brickwalk? It was a success right from the beginning?
You know, the big thing was the brick walk, was getting the bricks for the walks. That was quite a chore because a lot of the bricks they got would crumble. And it was a different way they made bricks then. So all the bricks had to be, at that time, hand-picked by his mason to make sure they would stand up. And then we had a good supply of them because a lot of them didn't, and we had the right brick to put back in it. But that was a tedious project of building those walks,
Okay.
and that's what added a lot of the character to it.
What was What was the origin of the name Brick Walk, do you think?
I don't know how that came out. Well, he got the name Brick Walk from Williamsburg or somewheres, and he just thought that would fit into the design.
And
Could
then
that have been a Wilmarth Lewis influence? Because Mrs. Lewis was a long-time contributor to the development of Williamsburg.
Yeah, I think there was. See, then there was Dr. Cogan's office, which was part of the house,
Yeah,
right, the old
which used
house.
to be our playhouse. We
Street,
moved
yeah.
that over, and then they added the front part
Yep.
to that office.
just occurred to me that Fred had asked about the origins and what are the motivations. One of the problems that we ran into as we got older was that playing baseball in the backyard was sort of got to be a problem because we could hit the ball further, and when they started rattling home runs off Dr. Cogan's office,
Yeah, that one.
you had to put something in between, so there was sort of an incentive, took away one of them.
Well, when they were
Needs.
building Brick Walk, there was 2 big maple trees
Yes.
up towards Farmington Avenue. And the garden club had a fit when they cut those down. And there's articles in the papers about how they condemned it and all. And then he built brick walk shops. Then they had to retract what he was doing, but they thought it was terrible. He was killing these beautiful big trees down. But,
I wonder what Pete Taylor had to say about it.
well, she agreed
Yeah.
because
She
did
had
it.
the bigger picture.
But-
Maybe he had
I'd like to get some.
Richard, would you just explain briefly what we've just seen, the picture of?
That is a picture of the Wright's Package Store, which is a historic schoolhouse being moved from over at Parsons down Farmington Avenue into Brick Walk Shops.
And it's on skids.
That's getting ready to put on skids to move it by Louis Turgeon.
Okay, good. And Fred, would you talk just briefly about the flowers in Brick Walk Lane? You said they were an important part of
From
it.
my recollections, whenever Brick Walks was talked about, long before the buildings actually were moved in, the concept, the vision was to have it be an act of historic preservation, and that include, and a holistic approach to historic preservation, to have not just the buildings and some of the interior design and so forth, and the bricks maybe, but also to have flowers from that related to that period. Now, I'm not into horticulture. I don't know the names of the flowers and so forth, but that's an important dimension, and it's reflected in all the efforts that my father, again, supported aggressively by my mother, spent making sure that we grew, arranged to acquire the right flowers and get them planted. So an important aspect of the brick walks. From the outset, the vision that my father had, shared by my mother, and very much reinforced by Pete Taylor, was to try to recreate the flowers that related to the period of the houses, if possible. And so a lot of effort went into creating these flower gardens, and again, it was another project of creation and initiation. And the pictures of my father watering the flowers in the in our backyard, as it were, and pictures of my mother standing looking at the flowers. So, yeah.
You have another picture that has a sign in it that says, "Beware of the asphaganthus." Is that another flower?
No. That was a sign that he got somewheres on his travels. And we set it up at the end of our driveway, which is a long downhill driveway. And on a Sunday, I think one day, I never forget this, a couple came down, they stopped, they read the sign, they put the car in reverse, backed all the way up that driveway. I think that happened about 4 different times. But it was really something because people read that sign and they were going to stay around.
Does anybody know what the word means?
No.
Sidelight of that, I can remember one of the few times in that era maybe that I was back in Farmington, and the phone rang one afternoon, and it was a fellow named Phil Hale, who lived in Farmington, down almost across from Wilmarth Lewis's, and he was a radio talk show host in Hartford. And he was calling up because somebody had asked about the asphaganthus. So I explained to Phil as best I knew it was just a comedy, and
Okay.
he said, "The best of your parents," and hung up. So it got coverage.
Okay. All right. Fred, you brought another photograph. Can you hold that up so that we can look at
And
it?
talk to it better.
Keep it toward the center.
Yeah, why don't you?
Well, I think it's going to be easier if Fred holds it in the center.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll hold it, you speak.
That's fine.
He's zeroing in.
Raise it just a tad, Fred, please. Thank you.
Okay. Are we ready?
Yes, we're on.
Oh, you're on.
Yeah,
Oh,
I had
okay.
it on.
All right. This is a photograph of Farmington Avenue. Did it ever look like that when you all lived there?
No.
We're looking west from the intersection of High and Farmington Avenue.
First of all, I think in my lifetime it was always plowed better than that was. But and I don't know that there was the trolley tracks were in yet. I don't know where those. That was before trolley tracks, I think. But the unique thing about it, to me, and I've sort of been looking for this, is it shows more of what we knew as the Whitman Tavern, but also what never saw, but sort of imagined there might have been something in the corner there, which appears to have been a barn, because that got obliterated in order to make room at some point that was converted to my father's office at 2 High Street. So it's some evidence of, I would think, showing that had been a working farm area at one time.
The trolley tracks went in 1894, and that picture, I think Betty would probably agree, predates 1894. It's probably in the 1880s.
Well, to be accurate, was that even known as Farmington Avenue at that point, or was it known as
Road to
Main Street?
Hartford.
It was the road to Hartford.
Road to
Okay, then.
Hartford.
All right. Did your dad have a sign for his office?
I think there's a sign. I don't know where it is. I almost can visualize it of a horse-drawn doctor's carriage,
Okay.
metal sign. So, but I think more distinctly I can remember that in the walkway into 2 High Street offices, there was planting, I think on both sides of the sidewalk and side of the wall. And my father put in several cherry tomato plants. So patients coming, or more likely leaving, could pluck a fresh tomato on their way out. And that was before the days of CDC trying to dictate how we should eat and so forth. So he was ahead of his grandchildren.
You know,
All right. So let's finish with you talking about the role that your mother played in the community after your father died and how things changed for her.
Well, there's no question. I don't believe that her role had changed. It hadn't changed. All of a sudden, she was landlord of Brickwalk and the holdings, and she managed that property by herself. I think well for many years, and without much help from Fred or I. Richard, being closer, had more of the burden, but I'm not sure how big a burden it was, because she kept things pretty well together. And then subsequent to the sale of those holdings, if you will, to Buzz Whitaker, and her relocation to Garden Street in Condolet, she fell into another community and another role. And she continued, from all reports, to be more concerned about more people than people were used to being cared about at random times and random thoughts.
Was she a natural nurturer?
Yes.
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 One story that I now remember well is, as a kid, I don't know, 9, 10 years old, I was sent at least every couple of weeks with a little something to give to Mrs. Lawrence. Was it Mrs. Lawrence? The lady who lived in a house, a small house, sort of behind our house, tucked in front of where the Brazils anyway, within walking distance.
Blazes?
Yes. And then this woman, after 2 or 3 years, moved down to Waterville Road in a little apartment. And my mission continued to bring her, I don't know, a piece of cake or something. And it was like a ritual. And there was no payment. This was just friendship towards this old woman who was in unstable health, but had been a good friend.
Again, one thing prompting another. One name that has not come up, which means more in later years to Fred and possibly more to me, was the name Tingley.
Oh, yeah.
Mrs. Tingley, and I'm not quite sure where she came into the scene, but she'd been a private duty nurse. And my father knew her, I'm sure, from associations of other patients he had. And our grandfather, my mother's father, had come to stay with us back in 1944, I think, for a vacation, had a stroke, which left him without much cognitive power. And he lived for a long time, too long, in Farmington, in what we knew as the guest room, just off the side of the house.
He couldn't walk.
He couldn't walk. He would get into periods when he had to be, of all things in those days, restrained. And Mrs. Tingley was his nurse, and that's where I first met or really recalled Mrs. Tingley. And so she was sort of part of the family and so forth. She had a grandson that came to Farmington to live with her one time. This would have been, I think, after my grandfather had passed away, but he knew my father, our grandson did, because he wrote a paper at Noah Wallace where he went. I'm not sure he graduated there, but he wrote a paper, he told me at one time, about our father and being a doctor. Well, Ty Tingley went on to become headmaster initially at Kingswood School, and then was hired away from Kingswood to go out to Minnesota to be headmaster of the Blake School, rather large school in Minneapolis, and then flashed back onto my screen and on Fred's screen because he became a principal of Phillips Exeter Academy. And still alive, retired, and at least two of my grandkids were handed their diploma from Exeter with Ty Tingley, who had been to Noah Wallace, and his grandmother part of our family at one time. And I somewhere there's reference to a Mr. Tingley who worked at the Elm Tree Inn at some time.
That's
So,
correct.
I'm just not sure of the connections, but she was a factor in town. Hmm?
Didn't we determine he lived on Waterville
Yeah, he did.
Road?
Yes, she did
They
live
did.
on one.
Yes, yes.
The Prentice Papers cover it.